than our recording, which everyone will be able to access. So without further ado, let me introduce Mark. I'll stop sharing my screen. So Mark Wilkie is the Carbon Management Director at Gaffney Klein. He started his career with BP, but since then he's worked a lot on decarbonisation, especially on renewable projects at Saudi Aramco and Heineken. So he's got quite a a varied perspective on this, and he's going to be talking to you guys about carbon pricing and the part that's going to play going forward in net zero. So without further ado, I will pass over to Mark. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Alison. And yeah, thanks for the invitation to speak today. This is actually my first time at the Society of Petroleum Engineers, and I'll be really interested to hear your questions, comments, and yeah, if you want to put them in the chat box, I'll do my best to pick them up as we go along, or we will have a Q&A session at the end. We can maybe run through them then. I just wanted to kind of open with maybe a snapshot of the last 6 months, which I think really kind of indicates the growing interest and awareness in carbon pricing. That the principle has been around for quite some time, and it's a mechanism that the UN, the IPCC have previously recommended as a reasonable means to encourage reduction of emissions in conjunction with policy. But if you take some of the highlights over the last 6 months, which kind of really show some major changes and some big steps forward, China introduced its national environmental trading scheme, becoming one of the largest, if not the largest, in terms of carbon emissions coverage. The carbon price in the EU environmental trading scheme went above 60 euros this month, a new high, and quite an increase from the kind of 23, 25 euros from last year. In addition to that, the EU announced its 55 plan middle of this year, and as part of that, looking to introduce a carbon border tariff, which potentially changes the reach of the European emissions trading scheme, bringing in some other countries that don't have any carbon pricing mechanism currently. The US have not been completely out of the picture, so they're also talking about carbon.
Sorry, Mark, can I just check?
Yeah.
Were you sharing your slides already? Because I can't see
Yes,
them.
I am. Yes, sorry. Okay, let me try.
I wasn't sure if you were doing a little preamble and
no, should be able to do. Let's see. Sorry. Oops.
Yep, that's it. Brilliant.
Okay, sorry. It looks like I'm clicking a button. So these are the headlines. Yeah. So the US also are now talking through the Biden administration about a carbon border tariff, and yeah, the long-awaited, much-anticipated COP26 gathering, which will take place next month, amongst a lot of hope and expectation. There's also some questions around potential movement on a more global approach to carbon pricing, so moving away from these kind of regional and national mechanisms. So, just taking that last 6 months, you can see there's a lot of activity, and it's kind of a good time to visit this topic. Now, if we look at where we are today, on the map on the left-hand side, you'll see from a policy point of view on carbon pricing and a net zero target point of view, which countries are currently have something in place, and you'll see immediately there's an awful lot of grey. So there are policies, there are pricing policies there. There are countries with targets. The countries with both you see in dark green. The countries with just a pricing policy you'll see in the brighter green. But really, from a geographic point, there's still quite some way to go in terms of having full geographic coverage globally with carbon pricing policy and some kind of net zero target in place. On the right-hand side in the donut, you'll see there the coverage with each of the three principal carbon pricing mechanisms. So the ETS, the Environmental Trading Scheme, which is also known as cap and trade, that covers about 16% of total global emissions. So those are multiple ETS schemes making up that 16%. Around 6% of emissions are currently covered by some form of carbon taxation, and just under 1% are covered by some kind of voluntary credit scheme. So there's really today still only around between 22 and 23% of our global emissions covered by some form of pricing mechanism. So there's still quite some way to go. The principle's clearly been set, but it's very patchy, and we still need to do a bit more. In terms of looking at who is impacted and who is potentially exposed to carbon pricing, really kind of gives us insight in terms of where carbon pricing is aimed at influencing. So here you have the different industry sectors broadly broken down. In the middle graph, what you see is ranges of carbon intensity in terms of CO2 emitted for revenue earned. And you'll see there's quite a spread. There's diversity between each of the sectors. There's also quite a range. The grey diamonds represent the 50% median of companies within that sector. The red diamond reflects the poorest performers in terms of the highest carbon intensity, the bottom 25% companies. And the green diamond represents the top performers in terms of the lowest emitters, which are the top 25% in those particular sectors. You'll also see there are some sectors that are going to be more exposed because of that carbon intensity. Cement really stands out, followed by steel. Power is another key sector. The transport services, so surface transport as well as aviation. Oil and gas is in there, but by no means the most exposed from a scope 1 and 2 emissions point. And then we have the likes of aluminium, which falls into metals and mining, and chemicals. On the right-hand side, you get a sense of the sensitivity to carbon pricing on the revenues of each of those sectors. So each of those colored dots represents a pricing scenario. So green's 50 euros a ton, grey's 100 euros a ton, and red is kind of at the top end in terms of 150 euros a ton. And just kind of interestingly looking at what each of those pricing scenarios potentially means for each of those sectors. And again, cement stands out by quite some way. So even at the lower pricing scenario, potential of impact of over 20% of their revenue could be down to carbon pricing. And then also steel at the top end could potentially be exposed to a 20% impact on revenue, given 150 euros. So there are clearly some sectors that are going to be more highly exposed and therefore going to have to look at solutions fairly quickly if they are to reduce that exposure. And kind of in summary, you've already got cement, aluminium, steel, power, transport, and oil and gas. So next, I just wanted to kind of go over the principal mechanisms and how they compare. these are the mechanisms where carbon is monetized either as a penalty or as a reward. We've got carbon taxation and the cap and trade scheme, which are classed as carbon compliance markets. And then we've got carbon credit, which is largely a voluntary market. So that's to say there is no obligation on emitters to participate. It's done on a purely voluntary basis versus the compliance market where there's some legislation or regulation, which means certain emitters have to or are subject to those markets. And then kind of going through the principles, the carbon taxation, as the name suggests, it's a tax, but it tends to be targeted at specific sources of emissions. It might be a fuel, it might be a particular industry or cross-section of industries, and it's a predefined rate. So you know exactly what the rate is per ton of CO2, and so by nature it's a stable price. It's very predictable, and it's something upon which an investment case can be built with some certainty. The downside or the weakness to it is, of course, you can set a carbon tax, but it's very difficult to predict exactly what the likely impact in terms of reduction on emissions might be. And so it can take quite a number of iterations in order to refine that to make sure you're not coming in too high or too low to achieve the required emissions reduction. Then you've got the carbon trade or cap and trade system, which is also known as environmental trading schemes. And this is a market-based system. An emissions limit is set as a cap, and then allowances can be traded around that cap. Because it's market-driven, price can be volatile. It's not completely certain, so it can go up, can go down. In general, the price reflects the ability of the market to meet that cap. So that's to say, if the market is well advanced and managing to reduce the emissions below that cap, then the prices will be relatively low. If it's failing or struggling to meet that cap, then the prices will be high. As with any market system, there is also an ability to hedge, so to basically future-proof against future prices, which can increase some volatility on the price. In principle, it's supposed to be, or it's designed to be the most cost-efficient way to set a price on carbon. So that's to say, it naturally balances the emissions reduction requirement with the cost to achieving that reduction. You get then a certainty by the fact that there is a cap and a limit in there in terms of what the emissions reduction is going to be, but there is no certainty in terms of where the pricing is going to land. And then you've really got the carbon credit scheme, which, as I say, is a voluntary scheme, originally designed to help sponsor and fund carbon reduction projects. So you may have seen things like reforestation or some kind of land management projects. But there are also a number of renewable energy projects in there. So it can be for carbon removal. It can also be for carbon avoidance. And generally, these are projects that are certified under internationally recognized schemes. And those projects are able to or eligible to receive credits, which can then be monetized to help sponsor the project. Those credits then are typically bought by a corporate who then uses them to reduce the emissions reported. Pricing's a kind of a hot topic. You know, where is the right price? When does it become effective? When is it too expensive? And here you'll see an overview on the left-hand side of the pricing as of 2020 for the key ETS schemes. And on the right, you'll see carbon pricing in 2020 for carbon taxation. The grey window there reflects the recommended carbon price corridor from the IPCC. So this is a corridor where they believe carbon pricing is effectual in terms of reducing the emissions, and outside of that is either too expensive or not high enough in order to be able to justify the business case for investing in the carbon reduction. And what you'll see in the ETS, ETS and cap and trade scheme is that actually there's only the EU ETS currently that falls within that corridor. And in the taxation schemes, there's an awful lot of taxation schemes, but again, it's the minority of taxation schemes that currently fall within that window. And from a global perspective, there's currently only 4% of global emissions which fall within that carbon price corridor. So again, there's quite a bit of work in terms of getting that pricing to the required level in order to make the investment decisions needed. Going into a bit more detail in terms of each of those schemes. So ETS, I think the EU ETS is a good example of a cap and trade scheme. It was established back in 2005. It's now in its 4th version. It's constantly evolving, and it's had periods where it hasn't performed terribly well. The scope of the scheme is to cover scope 1 and 2 emissions. It largely covers just the EU member states, but it also covers Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway, and there are some countries such as Switzerland, New Zealand looking to link their ETS schemes into the EU scheme. UK was in that scheme, and looks like it's going to have to ultimately link back into the EU scheme. It is sector specific, so it doesn't apply to every industry, every company. So the sectors it targets are aviation, power, and some of the big intensive industries like cement, steel, chemicals. And currently the target by the EU is to reduce emissions by 40% by 2030 based on a 1990 baseline, which equates to just over a 2% year-on-year reduction. Now there's already proposals to further expand that. And the kind of more significant ones are the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is this carbon border tariff, really aimed at stopping manufacturing and production moving outside of the EU zone to other countries that don't have any carbon pricing, but also to try and prevent producers within the zone being disadvantaged by lower cost products being imported. And that could potentially draw in other bigger nations such as Russia that still don't have a carbon pricing scheme in place, but it also could potentially draw in pretty big players like China also to participate in that. Now that scheme is due to start in 2026. There's quite some sensitivity around it because of the potential issues and challenges with trade. In terms of the sectors, it's also looking to expand the breadth of sectors it covers. So maritime looks like it's going to be included, and there's potential for a separate ETS for buildings and transport. But most significantly, it looks like the target is going to increase. So there is an ambition to increase the target by 2030, which would potentially double the amount of emissions to be reduced year on year. In the bottom right-hand corner, you see the carbon price trend through the EU ETS scheme, and you'll see for about a period of 5 years from 2013, it kind of bumped along the bottom below 10 euros a ton, and that was largely recognized as being a surplus of allowances that have been gifted and issued to a lot of emitters initially to try and help ease them coming into the scheme, but then actually started to significantly depress the overall price. Around 2019, they brought in a stability reserve mechanism, which allowed them to take some of that surplus out. And you can see there the price started rapidly increase. In 2020, there was the announcement on increasing targets for 2030, and that's where you started to see some activity in terms of hedging for the future. And now you've got a price around 60, 63 euros a ton. So it's constantly evolving, and I think it's fair to say the current price in the EU ETS is probably higher than most expected. Yeah, we'll see where it goes in the future. In terms of an example of carbon tax, I thought kind of look at the Netherlands industry carbon tax. So that was brought in at the end of last year. Again, quite a good example of where the government of the Netherlands decided that industry was lagging largely. Power had made quite some steps in terms of decarbonisation, but industry was still lagging. They have 4 or 5 major companies in the Netherlands that make up 25% of the country's emissions, and those emissions were just not improving. So they decided to bring in a carbon taxation scheme which would work in tandem with the EU ETS, so kind of side by side, but would effectively set a floor for carbon pricing, and again, eliminate that uncertainty and volatility that the EU trading scheme inherently has. And most starkly, you see here that by 2030, in the Netherlands, for those industry sectors that fall into it, there's 235 companies at the moment, 235 industrial companies that fall into it. They're looking at a carbon price of just under 150 euros. And that really completely transforms business case for a lot of potential carbon abatement projects. The third scheme, as a kind of an example of a credit and how that's being used, is a scheme known as 45Q. It's section 45Q of the US federal tax code, and it has been designed specifically to incentivize investment in carbon capture and storage. And it's been around some time. It was established back in 2008, but it isn't until recently that it's really started to draw attention. Later on, I'll kind of show you an example of a project that we've worked on. Yeah, so basically the principle behind it is, again, to give investors certainty on a value for carbon through a tax credit. And the way the scheme works is that if you start building the project before 2026, you're eligible to claim a credit for a period of 12 years. And from 2026 onwards, it's indexed against inflation. Now, there are 2 tiers of credit. There is a credit eligible for projects that are able to store the carbon permanently, and that attracts a slightly higher credit. 2026, that's about 50 euros. And then for projects where the carbon is being used for enhanced soil recovery or even utilization in other products, the carbon tax rate's around $35 a ton from 2026. So again, this scheme, again, as a credit is voluntary, but what we're seeing is quite a bit of interest being stimulated from investors, from owner operators off the back of this incentive. So I thought I'd share with you kind of a cross section. It's not an exhaustive list, but kind of a cross section of where we're seeing requests and kind of growing awareness from clients on carbon pricing. Yeah, the first one is really looking at the future cost of oil and gas production. And so what we've done is looked at the carbon intensity to be able to lift and produce the oil and gas, and then looked at pricing scenarios, so carbon pricing scenarios, to see how those products then compare with products from other countries. And yeah, again, you see quite big shifts depending on the carbon intensity, depending on the country in which it came from, as to the competitiveness of those products. The second one really is around carbon abatement. And our role for clients in that case can be to look at the technical feasibility of particular solutions, but then to look at the economics behind each of those solutions and establish what the carbon price needs to be in order to make each of those solutions viable, with a view then to establishing a marginal cost curve. So from the solutions which can work with a negative carbon price, which means they're a cost saver, to those that have almost a net zero marginal cost, which means that neither costs you or saves, to the ones that have heavily positive carbon price break even. And that's really just to kind of help prioritize and select the projects that can have biggest impact, but also the ones that have the better economics, putting those at the front of a project pipeline. We're also seeing growing interest in hydrogen. So I guess there's a lot of speculation and discussion at the moment on hydrogen. So these are typically blue hydrogen projects. So taking conventional gray hydrogen processes and capturing the CO2 emitted, and again storing it to create blue hydrogen. So again, our role really is to look at the technical feasibility of that, the associated costs of doing that, and then really to understand under certain carbon pricing scenarios how it competes and compares with both current natural gas and hydrocarbon prices, but also how it might compete and compare in the future with other sources of hydrogen, such as green hydrogen from renewables. One of the core areas that we've been involved with for quite a number of years now is on carbon capture and storage, really on the back of our kind of expertise in subsurface. Again, looking in a similar way to hydrogen, to look at the technical feasibility, first of all, of capturing those sources, the cost of transporting it and storing it, and then really to look at the pricing scenarios which would make those projects viable. So in essence, really, the way clients are currently looking at carbon pricing is to really look at it from a future point. So, as you saw in the opener, picture's pretty patchy. You saw pricing is still kind of on the low side at the moment. But with the request we're getting, we see expectation, I would say, from the market that those prices are going to potentially increase. And naturally, those clients want to know both what the impact is to their existing business and where the opportunities might be for the future. So just taking one of those examples and looking a bit more in detail. So this is based on a project in the US, looking at carbon capture and storage. So looking at all the way from the potential sources of CO2 to the potential sinks for CO2. Our scope was really driven off the back of the 45Q tax credit scheme. As I say, there's quite a lot of interest at the moment from the US, from investors, from asset owner operators. And it starts with trying to identify potential sources, the volumes, the distances and proximities within the existing infrastructure of those sources, assessing the technical feasibility of capturing it and the cost for doing that, and how that might be supported or helped along by the tax credit, looking at potential storage options in terms of the capacity, so the volumes that can be taken, the injectivity and the ability of the reservoir to safely and permanently store the CO2, and then ultimately to map out where those opportunities are and to build a financial case based on those volumes of CO2 and where we see those sources eventually being stored. The first part of the scope really was to identify the sources, and no two sources are the same. And there's actually such a thing as a better source from a financial point, and a not so good source from a financial point. At the top, you see those emitters that are emitting CO2 at the higher intensities, higher pressures, and those require less equipment and plant to capture the CO2, and therefore it makes the capital investment from a capture point lower versus the ones at the bottom of the list, which are a lower intensity, lower pressure. So the likes of post-combustion on power being a very relatively high complexity in terms of capture and a relatively high cost, versus a natural gas or an ammonia plant, which has a higher intensity, higher pressure CO2, which makes the complexity and the cost a lot lower. And we kind of tag those top ones as kind of capture ready because they're almost ready to go. But it's also crucial to understand the volumes that are available to capture in the first place. It's really around the utilization of those assets. So obviously, the higher the volumes you can capture, the higher the utilization, the lower the cost per ton of CO2 captured, transported. And what you see here is a cross-section of the types of emitters. Towards the left-hand side, there were fertilizer manufacturers, some hydrogen production, chemical manufacturers, and those unfortunately were on the lower volume side, versus power in the middle was probably one of the most dominant emitters in terms of CO2 volume. And then on the far right hand side, there were thermal gas boilers, refineries, and steel plants. So the complexity is really both around the available volumes, the quality of the CO2 that's being emitted, and therefore the ability and the cost to capture it. And putting that into a kind of simple framework, here you see the cost per ton of CO2 from each of those sources. So on the left, you have capture ready, which under the current 45Q scheme look viable. Then in the middle, you've got hydrogen, which is just coming under the $50 per ton tariff for sequestration. So that's permanent storage. But then you've got power generation on the far right hand side, where you see quite a spread and also relatively high cost per ton of CO2. And that's going to need a revision, an enhancement on that tariff if those sources are to be captured using CCUS. Our understanding is that those revisions are on their way, but essentially it really at the moment means that under the current tax scheme, it's really the capture ready processes, the ammonia, syngas, and hydrogen, which are already viable. So I just close out and kind of summarize. In terms of carbon pricing today, there's plenty of established mechanisms, but the overall geographic coverage is pretty limited, but growing. Really, it's going to be the heavy industrial energy consumers that are going to be most highly exposed to future carbon price. Pricing's still not where it is in general, or where it needs to be in general. There's only 4% of global emissions that really fall within a let's say, a reasonable price band to be able to encourage and incentivize the carbon abatement. We're seeing already that there's increasing interest and awareness on carbon pricing, despite the fact that there's not a full global coverage on it. And we're already seeing in some markets that there's an emerging investment case for carbon mitigation using carbon capture and storage. So with that, I'll close, and I'm happy to take some questions. I didn't see the bubbles popping up on the chat box, but maybe I can take a quick look.
Yeah, there's been quite a lot of questions there. Some great questions. That was brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, some really good background on carbon pricing and where it is now. That quite a lot to take in for a lot of us. But we've certainly, that carbon intensity of cement, that got me. I didn't realize it was so off the scale compared to everything else, and you know it's not just about our industry. So yeah, we've captured all the questions in a sheet, so I'll try and get to them. We've only got a few minutes, so
yeah, I can always post some answers later on if we don't get.
Yeah. I mean, some are interesting. I mean, it's interesting about the 45Q scheme that you talk about in the States. There was one question from Mick about, would a carbon capture scheme be able to take credit under the ETS or any likely carbon tax? I guess trying to ask about, you've got that scheme in the States, what about in Europe?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I mean, when you look at the economics on that 45Q example, you'd say, well, yeah, why not? And I think if the carbon price stays where it is, then yeah, there's no reason why a carbon capture scheme couldn't be invested on the back of that. I mean, really, to make it an investment case using it, you would need an emitter that falls under the EU ETS. So there is a threshold where you need in order to be subject to it, you need to have a certain size of emissions and come from a certain sector. But power is one, so a large power producer would fall under that, and yes, you could potentially then use that for an investment case. Yeah.
Okay, good. And there was a similar question from Swati, I guess, talking about blue hydrogen produced from natural gas. How would that fit into like a carbon credit scheme?
Yeah, so the principle of blue hydrogen is that you're obviously capturing the CO2 emissions following the SMR process. Again, really, in terms of a tax credit, I'm not aware at the moment of a scheme in place, but that could change. From an EU ETS point, I think you would have to demonstrate that you're taking an existing process and plant and removing those emissions. So you'd need to see an emission saving from an existing in order to monetize that. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, I've done a bit of training on emissions inventories lately, so I know a bit of that. And one of the questions from Barney kind of touches on that, which is carbon pricing assumes tonnage of CO2 from an emitter is known. How do we ensure that the measurement of emissions is consistent from company to company, industry to industry, country to country? I mean, that's quite a big question, but if you've just got some comments on that.
Yeah. So I mean, if we use the EU ETS as an example, so there is a public register. The emitters, it can be on a facility by facility basis, but they have to report verifiable emissions. Potentially those can be audited. But yeah, I think with all of this, the systems are evolving and developing. And yeah, I think as the question came, it is going to be a crucial point in terms of establishing exactly the emissions.
Yeah. Let's see. The first question we got actually from Richard Oblath. the Chinese ETS price does not appear to be market driven. Do you worry about manipulation by the Chinese government to protect some of the state-owned enterprises? Again, about things being fair across the board, I guess.
Yeah, I think China's an interesting, interesting example. I guess we all assume it's kind of a command and control type structure. What we have seen is that a lot of the national companies, some of the national oil companies, national steel companies, have now aligned their carbon reduction targets with the national target. Now, in terms of the ETS, yeah, we haven't seen data yet, and it's only started running, I think, since February. And the pricing from the previous regional schemes was very, very low, so it was kind of between $1 and $2 a ton. Yeah, I mean, in terms of manipulation, I think you have to assume they're going to properly run it. I think the bigger fear for China is the carbon border tariff that the EU are announcing. Mm-hmm. So if you take, for example, aluminium is a major export for China. I think something like 40% of it, though, currently is produced with coal, which would not compete well with, well, even hydro aluminium from Norway or Russia. So I think actually the fear is actually the other way around. So, but let's see how it plays out. Yeah. I think, it's in the interest from a trade as well as an environmental point to have a scheme which is properly administered.
Yeah, going to make it work. Question from not sure who that is, but talking about difference between hiking duty on petrol and diesel versus introducing a new carbon tax. So I guess different ways of making this happen. What do you have an opinion on that?
No, I mean, I think they're basically a taxation system. I think there is talk of in the EU of having a fuel targeted scheme. Germany's already introduced its own ETS for fuel. I think that's on the back of recognition that fuel still, from a transportation point, is still relatively untouched. But yeah, I mean, in the end, it's a form of taxation. I guess it's just again a matter of how those systems are administered.
Yeah, different ways of doing it. Yeah, I guess we'll do a final one, another one from Barney, just where we sit now on where the UK sits regarding a border tariff and how that will align with the EU. Just as a kind of final comment.
That's a really interesting question. I think there's a lot of different views on this. Yeah, I think kind of the latest sentiment on the UK ETS is it's performing, but it's not as it should. I've seen recently that there's the speculation that it will eventually link back to the EU ETS. I wouldn't have thought it would be viable for the UK to introduce its own carbon border scheme. You need some materiality from a trading point, so I think it would make more sense for it to join a bigger bloc, which already has a carbon border mechanism in place, rather than trying to introduce something.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, so that was a kind of whirlwind through carbon pricing. Thank you very much. There might be some others that you can answer in the chat.
Sure.
I guess it's interesting to understand that it's evolving and there's iterations of things to make it work, and hopefully it will all even up between countries and sectors and things as we go forward, but it's clearly quite complex.
Yeah, it's very complex and moving really, really quickly.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's going to increasingly become a sensitive sensitivity on investment cases. Yeah.
No, that was great. And it's great to hear how companies are trying to future-proof. And I guess it's all about risk management, especially for companies in our oil and gas sector as to how they move forward. Right, so let's move on to our second speaker today. Thanks, Mark. I don't want to cut his time short. So our second speaker is Dr. Richard Norris. He's a fellow of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute and is managing partner at Pandreco Energy Advisors. So I can't read my own handwriting. He's a well-known speaker and author on energy economics. You might well have seen some of his articles on LinkedIn, and I'm looking forward to him giving a thought-provoking and probably provocative talk on the role of energy in society and economics for everyone. So as I mentioned, he's keen for this to be interactive. So please, if you have questions as you go along, you can put them in the chat, but also feel free, if you feel like joining the debate at the end, to use the raise hand function, and we will unmute you and you can join the conversation. Okay, thank you very much, Richard. I'll hand over to you.
Hi, Alison, thank you. I can't see my Zoom screen, so can you tell me whether the slides are being shown and whether you can see and hear me?
Yes, we can see your slides. I'm not sure what mode it's in, but I think it's big enough for everyone to see it, so I think that's fine.
Here it's in the presentation mode, so hopefully we'll do that.
Yeah, looks good.
Great. Well, I've got, as usual, I wanted to do a short talk and have lots of questions, and I've ended up doing what's quite a lot of slides, so I'll kick off. And I'm going to talk today about the 3 E's, energy, economics, and the environment. And I want to start off by asking you to think about what the economics would look like on a tropical island. And for this experiment, assume that you are completely alone, and importantly, that you're not going to be rescued. You get to take a couple of items with you. And in this case, I'm going to give you a choice. You can either have all the money and gold that you can eat, or you can have some kind of energy supply, and with that some tools. Now, whether that's solar panels with electric tools or a very large source of petroleum with a generator and power tools. Now, hopefully you're going to choose the source of energy and the tools that come with it. Why? Because you're going to have to farm the land, you're going to have to build shelter, you'll want light and maybe a desalination to get fresh water, and basically you're going to have to construct a life for yourself. And in those circumstances, money, Bitcoin, gold bars, they're all totally and utterly useless. The things that have worth, the things that will make your life easier and in a sense even possible, will require energy, and your muscle power alone won't get you very far. So to build on this point, it's really questioning what money actually is. And we know of it as a placeholder for trade. It's in normal currencies. And economists think of trade and the economy and money as all about being about the same thing. Whereas when you look at the world through the lens of energy, it's more about the availability of energy. And in this thought experiment, which I borrowed with permission from a presentation by Nate Hagens, what he said was, try imagining, a helicopter drops a large amount of money over the town where you live. And the question is, what would happen? Well, the answer is you'd probably give up quickly on this presentation, run outside and collect a bag full of money. But then the question is, what would happen next? And it's really quite straightforward. That money will be transformed into either goods or services. Basically, we'll buy stuff. And you could say, well, maybe you'll put the money in the bank. But if you do that, all that happens is the bank will lend that money with some additional leverage to businesses or to people. And those businesses and people will in some way use goods and services. So in all of these circumstances, having extra money means you're going to use more goods and services. And in doing so, you're going to crystallize the use of energy in the production of goods and the actualization of services. So people who look at energy economics refer to money as a call on energy. Now, if we're going to think about classic economics, this is usually represented by land, labor, and capital. And more recently, there's been the addition of entrepreneurship. And when I look at this, I see something missing. There is some kind of assumption about the energy input. And the assumption is that it is essentially limitless and free. The cost of wages, the labor element, is typically orders of magnitude greater than the cost of energy. But when we think of this from an energy point of view, we can see the importance of the ignored inputs. The labor part work only has a certain amount of work that can be done by humans, but it's massively leveraged by the use of resources and particularly of energy. Now, it's probably not a coincidence the whole edifice of modern economics has been built during the last 150 years, which is a period where the world has had increasing access to more and more energy-dense sources, making it appear limitless, free, and, to an economist's point of view, unimportant. The second part of economics I'd like to mention is how supply, demand, and prices interact. Now, in a normal situation, when you have reduced supply or where you have increased demand, typically prices move higher. An example of this is Uber's surge pricing mechanism. The idea being that the higher price will change behavior. It will encourage drivers to enter the market or stay in the market if it's late at night, and it may encourage people not to take Ubers, but thereby reducing the demand, because essentially they're being priced out of the market and they have to take the tube or a bus or walk. This is the sort of market mechanics that can be piggybacked on by governments, and they do that with subsidies and taxes. Now, these can artificially increase or decrease prices with the aim of changing behavior. This example of cigarettes is quite impressive. Now, obviously, there were other things going on as well, such as public information campaigns about the dangers of smoking, but there's a clear correlation between cigarette consumption and the tax burden. In a free market, the price acts as a market signal to fix a disequilibrium. In a managed market, the price is used to change behavior. Now, here's an example where this concept has failed spectacularly. And this is from Texas and the polar vortex that hit last February. And there's been a lot of discussion about what actually happened in Texas. And rather like the current energy crisis in Europe, there are multiple causes, and it's not my intention to go into those here. What I want to show you is how the relationship of price and supply broke down. Now, normally generators get paid about $30 per megawatt hour, which on this scale basically doesn't even register. It's the flat line on the right-hand side of the top graph. As the crisis unfolded, the gas generators ramped up their capacity from a low point of 5 gigawatts to almost 45 gigawatts. And to give you an idea of the scale of that, for those of you who are not familiar with sort of electricity, the UK peak consumption in the depths of winter for 68 million people is about 43 or 44 gigawatts. So in Texas, natural gas on its own was doing all of that. And during that period, the price rose from dollars per megawatt. It rose by a factor of about 4,000% to a cap of $1,200 per megawatt hour. And that was a limit that was imposed by what's called the Public Utility Commission, the PUC, on the grid operator ERCOT. And on the morning of the 15th of February, a lot of gas production went offline for reasons to do with not having enough winterization. And we can see that coal and nuclear also had issues at the same time, but they were less significant. Gas capacity dropped by about 15 gigawatts at a crucial moment. So what the PUC decided to do on a very brief morning meeting on the 15th was to increase the price cap. So they said, let's raise the cap from $1,200 per megawatt hour to $9,000 per megawatt hour, and let's watch all that power come back on. Now, with hindsight, it looks a bit silly, because any and all gas generators that can earn a 40 times increase in their revenue with no change to their cost base is going to jump on that and max out the generation. So when the price was increased to $9,000 per megawatt hour, the ability of the market to respond was zero. All that happened in this case was the people who had been making $1,200 per gigawatt hour were suddenly receiving $9,000, and obviously they were pretty happy. The result was that in the next 3 days, the electricity bill for Texas topped $50 billion. And that can be contrasted with the total annual bill for electricity generation in Texas, which is normally about $35 billion. Now, these costs are being passed on to consumers, and everybody is struggling with how they're going to manage this, and it's a big mess. But the bottom line here is that the supply was completely inelastic. Demand was what it was. Tragically, people were literally dying of cold, and it didn't matter what you did to the price of electricity. The capacity was constrained by the infrastructure. So hopefully this illustrates that energy is not just a consumer product, but an essential underpinning of our social construct. And I think that's an important lesson for us, because as we see what's happening in Europe at the moment, the global market for gas is supply constrained. This isn't a nasty OPEC cartel managing the supply side. This is an unforeseen demand-supply mismatch. Europe is being outbid by China, India, and Brazil, and Europe will struggle to pay these bills, which could potentially lead to more unrest like the Gilets jaunes we saw in the past. But one thing that China is desperately wary of is unrest within its population, who have been promised a brighter future. And when the lights start going out, as they have recently, the gloves will come off and they will ramp up their coal production and they will buy up all the gas on the market. And given that China has trillions of dollars worth of foreign reserves, they will outbid Europe every day. Well, we can see a similar effect on inelasticity in demand when we look at oil. This is essentially oil production, and production and consumption are the same thing for oil. Since the 1980s, there has been virtually a linear trend in consumption, almost irrespective of price. And this is a function of increasing population, it's a function of increasing urbanization and affluence. So there's very little in there apart from a blip associated with the great financial crisis. Where we did see demand affected by price was in the late 1970s. And this is significant because there was a genuine oil shock. Essentially what happened was oil went up by a factor of 10. It went from about $4 a barrel to about $40 a barrel over the space of 7 or 8 years. And it's pretty hard to imagine that level of increase. So if we forget about $80 a barrel where we are today, but say there's an equilibrium price of $50 or $60 a barrel, this would be the equivalent to going to $500 or $600 a barrel today. And clearly, if that happened, people would drive less, they would fly less, there would be less movement of goods, demand would be affected. Now, I'd like to just try and tie this back a little bit to the previous excellent talk. And we heard a lot about carbon pricing. As I mentioned earlier, carbon pricing is a tax. It's not really designed to raise revenue for government, although governments love that sort of thing and they get quite addicted to it, which is a problem. But what it is designed to do is to change people's behavior. So carbon taxes, with the European market being at about 60 euros per ton, that's not too far off $100 per ton, which would equate to $12 to $15 per barrel. So today that would take oil from $80 to about $95 a barrel. Well, that's a long way from the $500 a barrel we were talking about just now, but it is a non-negligible increase. And there's going to come a point where this additional tax is going to be problematic. And given that we have seen that oil can vary from $20 a barrel to about $140 a barrel, it strikes me that it's very unlikely that the $100 per ton carbon pricing is going to have much effect on people's behavior other than just upsetting them. And in the overall theme of be careful what you wish for, these two graphs illustrate the importance of oil. In the first graph, oil prices seem to be closely correlated with food prices. And in the second, we can see the huge role of oil in transport. 100% of aviation is based on oil. Almost 100% of maritime transport uses oil or gas. And about 90-something% of ground transport is based on oil, with a minor input of rail being electrified. But these illustrate the idea of embedded energy and how the changes in the price of energy feed through into the general economy. Now, this graph, which is from the Financial Times, and what it shows is the oil price as a function of GDP. It's not the oil price in dollar terms. And according to the study that this was based on, when the world pays more than 5% of GDP for oil, it triggers recessions. Oil literally lubricates the wheels of international commerce and trade and globalization. So it's not surprising that there is this very strong correlation between oil price and recessions in global trade. Another way of looking at the same idea, and this should probably be taken qualitatively, not quantitatively, when oil prices are low, essentially this is a driver of economic growth. When oil prices are in the sort of middle band, it's probably not enough to trigger recessions, but are not enough to drive growth. And there's definitely a level at which oil prices will cause recessions and crash the global economy. So to get back to this idea of why energy is so important to economics and to the economy, we can ask the question of, well, what is energy? And I think we all sort of think that we know what it is, but actually when you come down to really trying to put a definition on it, it gets surprisingly hard. And what I've taken here is from a French commentator on energy, whose name is Jean-Marc Jancovici. Excuse me. And he says that energy is a notion that characterizes a change of state in a system. And he gives a whole bunch of examples, which I'll let you read at your leisure. But it's very clear that whenever you do anything, we change the state of a system. It can be moving a mass in a gravitational field. It can be a chemical reaction. can be a change of acceleration, a change of temperature, and so on and so forth. And all of these things use or yield energy. And most of the things we need to do to create order in the world use energy. They don't give up energy. And that's basically the idea of entropy, or the second law of thermodynamics. So when we think about the modern world, we sometimes forget just how extraordinarily mechanized and industrialized modern society is. Food production is a form of primary energy. Oil production and mining are highly mechanized, as is manufacturing. Instead of food-powered people doing the work, you need machines, and the machines leverage cheap energy. We have transportation, which I have already mentioned, that's absolutely dominated by oil at the present time. And one way of trying to conceptualize this is if the work would be done by humans, we would need to have hundreds or thousands of humans doing that work. Now, we don't have humans doing that work. They're doing other things, luckily. But what we do have, and again, going back to what Nate Hagen says, he refers to these as fossil fuel slaves. We have this enormous leverage that's given to us by the fact that we have a lot of surplus energy in the economy. So let's talk now about surplus energy. If we think of a non-economic situation, which is basically a form of subsistence living, illustrated here by the bear needs to move, it needs to keep warm, it needs to reproduce, and it needs to hunt. So its primary energy source is fish, and its method of energy extraction is hunting fish. And then it spends the rest of its time doing whatever it needs to do. But there's no notion of having a large excess of surplus fish, which could go on to become a tradable or an economy. Humans started this way and then did things differently. They got good at hunting and they got good at farming. So we produced a surplus of primary energy. And this was a really significant moment in human development because it allowed people to go off and do things other than basic subsistence. Now, those things could be writing poetry, but they could also be crafts and trade and technology and innovation. And the great thing about trade and technology and innovation is that it creates a positive feedback loop where you make better tools, you improve your farming methods, you improve your hunting, you create more surplus energy, which frees up more people. So we have a situation today where the vast majority of people in modern developed societies are many times removed from primary energy generation, which perhaps explains some of the blind spot that we have about it. Now, obviously, people in this room are more closer to it, as are farmers. But other than that, and I'd use this illustration in homage to my now 18-year-old son, who would love to be a professional video games player. You know, it's hard to imagine being paid a lot of money to play video games. It's as far removed from subsistence survival as I can imagine. And it is made possible by the fact that we have so much surplus energy in our system that people can do all these things, whilst a very few people create the stuff that actually makes the economy work. And just to give an idea of what that leverage looks like, the average American has an energy footprint of 230,000 kilocalories. Only 3,000 of these are actually eaten. So there's 70 times leverage on what they eat is what they get from the surplus of energy in the economy. Now, if you move away from what individuals do and more sort of holistically towards how the economy looks, this is a good representation of a system where there is a lot of surplus energy. We have a total amount of energy that is available, and we only need a small amount, the brown circle, to replenish the stock of energy that we're using for the next iteration. And there's a very large amount of energy, which is the green circle, that is available for non-energy related economic activity. That's basically everything else, apart from sort of drilling oil wells, mining and growing food. When we first started finding oil, and this illustration is Spindletop, which blew out, I think, in 1908, it was estimated to be flowing at about 100,000 barrels a day. Now, obviously, the blowout is not a great thing, but focus on that flow rate. 100,000 barrels a day of high quality crude from a well that was drilled a few hundred feet deep with a wooden derrick, maybe 20 guys in the whole crew and a couple of horses. The amount of surplus energy that well provided was off the scale compared to anything we do today. And you can compare that to, for example, a shale well, which may produce, if you're lucky, 700, 800 barrels a day. And we know that they decline very fast and will probably be down to 80% of its flow rate in the first 2 or 3 years. So when that happens, you're in a situation where you need to spend a lot more energy on replacing the energy that you're using. And what that means is, by definition, there's less energy available for all the other stuff that the economy needs. This is the notion of energy return on energy invested, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. But it's worth bearing in mind because I'm going to use this sort of formulation of the amount of energy that's required to maintain a system and the amount of energy that's surplus and allows for everything else to happen in the economy. So as an example of a high energy cost system, where there is not much left available for economic activity, we can look back at what the world was like in the pre-industrial era about 300 years ago, when it ran exclusively on 100% renewable energy. The trick, of course, was that the population wasn't 7.8 billion people, it was about 600 million. Globally, over 85% of the population was rural and mostly working in agriculture. And to take a phrase a little bit out of context, life was nasty, brutish, and short. Life expectancy in 1800 was in the region of 34 years in Europe. And there's a system where you don't have people who are paid to play video games because everybody is basically too busy surviving. So large amounts of surplus energy in the economy creates for individuals prosperity and discretionary capital. So instead of spending all your time or money on food production and basic needs, you can start to have these basic needs costing a smaller and smaller proportion of your revenue. So when you look at how this has evolved over time, and I think this is data from the United States, something like 55% of a household's disposable income was spent on the basics, food, transport, clothing, and so on. And what has happened over the last 100 years is that the amount of surplus energy in the economy has increased, and the percentage that is spent on the necessities has dropped. This allows people to feel much wealthier. It allows people to go on vacation. It allows you to buy nicer stuff in abundance. It allows you to have a car instead of a bicycle. All of the things that billions of people aspire to across large sections of the world. The problem is, or the question is, what happens next? If we end up with a system where the overall energy surplus decreases, and there are two reasons why it may decrease. One of them, as I mentioned earlier, is that we have used up a lot of the easy oil and gas. What's ahead of us is that there's plenty of oil out there, but it's going to be difficult to get at, and it's going to be expensive both monetarily and energetically to get at. And when we think about replacing fossil fuels with renewables, we have a similar issue that the energy return on energy invested is also much lower. And the net result is that we may well have a system where we end up essentially becoming poorer. That's what happens when the cost of energy goes up. And we may even be accelerating that by putting carbon taxes on it. How does that affect the other economy? Well, if what I've told you so far is correct, what we would expect to see is that one of the drivers of valuation of companies that produce nice shiny gadgets, and I've taken Apple as an example here, because paying well over $1,000 for a new phone with built-in obsolescence is a business model that really only works when there is a very large amount of disposable income. If everybody's busy surviving, we're not going to have iPhones. What happens when the price of oil goes up? Well, rather pleasingly, a couple of days ago, I saw this headline: as oil spikes, Apple drops. Well, that's exactly what you would expect to happen. I've taken this from a LinkedIn post and trying to tie this back to the notion of carbon prices and energy prices. And I blocked out the name of the person who wrote this because the person in question is a very nuanced and intelligent commentator on the energy space. And I don't think this particular comment is very representative in some ways. So I certainly don't want to throw stones, but it's something that I see quite often. And it's this comment: we need higher energy prices to encourage lower consumption and investment in buildings. Now, it's correct, we could indeed use less energy, and energy efficiency is a very important topic, although I think it's a lot more complex than people think it is. But the problem I have with this kind of comment is that it doesn't really reflect the reality for a large number of people. Now, this graph in the top left, it shows something that would look a lot worse today than when this graph was done in 2017. But what this study showed was for the wealthiest 10% of households in the UK, when energy prices tick up, household expenditure increased from 2% to 3%. That's the green line at the bottom here. So essentially, the effect of increasing energy costs was invisible. So wealthy people can sit there and say that what we need are higher energy prices because it will change people's behavior. However, if you look at the red line, which is the lowest 10% of households, well, that same limited rise in the cost of energy took their expenditure from 6% to nearly 12% of their household expenditure. And this is what is behind the headlines about energy poverty and people having to make a choice: heat or eat. So just saying we need higher energy prices is not a solution in itself, because it will just encourage inequality. Now, I've taken this slide from a very different presentation, so I don't want to dwell on it too much, but I think it's very important to consider the ramifications of this inequality that we have in developed nations, but also the way in which developing nations who are starting off from a position of energy poverty will think about the cost of energy and the choices they will make. For many people, the energy transition is a transition out of energy poverty. And generally speaking, they will go for the cheapest energy they can get. So the Energy Trilemma, many of you will be familiar with this. For the last 7, 8, possibly 10 years, the whole energy discussion has been focused on the environmental impact, specifically greenhouse gas emissions, but now about methane, and in the past, oil spills, ozone depletion, and acid rain, and indeed the concerns around nuclear power. What is becoming increasingly clear is that even the mainstream media and some of the slightly less deaf politicians are working out that the environmental impact is only one part of this important trilemma. Now, of course, if you believe that the entire human race is going to be wiped off the planet in 12 years' time, if we don't solve greenhouse gas emissions today, then sure, we should focus on that. If you take a slightly more nuanced view, that actually we have two problems to solve here. One of them is, according to the IPC, a fairly long-term, multiple-decade effect of increasingly problematic climatic conditions, none of which actually refer to a completely existential threat to humans. The other is a much more immediate effect of increasing cost of energy and a related decrease in reliability and resilience, which will manifest itself in increasing poverty. And it's worth remembering here that people die of cold far more than they die of heat. Now, this is a very laudable analysis of how the Netherlands might get to net zero, and we heard from Mark some stuff about the Netherlands earlier. And without going into details about the various solutions and the fact that many of these solutions just do not exist at scale, the important thing is that almost all of them require carbon pricing to make them work, and that these carbon prices range up to several hundred euros per ton. So the implication is the overall cost of energy will increase, which will reduce the amount of money and energy available for the rest of the economy, i.e. we'll go to a situation where people will get poorer. It's not necessarily going to be a great vote winner. At the same time, as I've mentioned previously, we have the increasing scarcity of cheap fossil fuels. So business as usual will lead to the use of lower net energy resources, and that will also push towards economies with less surplus energy, and it has the same implication of less prosperity. So in some ways, we're at something of a crossroads. We currently have a system where we have a large amount of surplus energy that is produced, which allows for all of the rest of the economic activity that we take for granted and probably wouldn't want to not have. But it is a polluting element, and it is argued, probably quite correctly, that the true cost of this energy isn't actually cheap because we are polluting the environment and socializing the costs. What people would like, and what people are being promised on the other hand, is that we can have exactly the same system with large amounts of surplus energy, but it will be clean and cheap. This seems to be extremely unlikely unless something like nuclear fusion actually does have a breakthrough. And then maybe, just maybe, we could get into this situation. What is actually happening is we have a scenario where our future may look rather more like our past, where we are reliant on energy sources which have low energy density. They have a low energy return on energy invested, and we will have less surplus energy in the economy to allow 8 billion people to be wealthy and, importantly, to be resilient. Now, there's an even worse scenario, which is if we continue business as usual, we will use up the remaining cheap, easily accessible hydrocarbons, and we'll have a system where we'll only have difficult to get at, expensive, low return on energy invested hydrocarbons, and we'll be in a sort of Mad Max scenario where we have dirty polluting fuels and they will be expensive. So we'll have the worst of both worlds. Now, having left you with that cheerful thought about Mad Max and the crossroads, I'm going to make some predictions about COP26 since it's only 2 weeks away. Now, hopefully this is under Chatham House rules, but I guess it is being recorded, so maybe I should be careful about these. Only 2 weeks ago, Boris was on stage in New York telling us that not only was it easy to be green, but it was also lucrative. I suspect that last comment may have been unscripted and perhaps had his advisors rolling their eyes. but he was doing this at exactly the time that there was clear evidence that the cost of energy is not so straightforward. So my predictions are quite simple. I suspect that the key players in the energy transition, China, India, and quite possibly Russia, will send low-level delegations, and they're probably going to be fairly obstructive. China is extraordinarily unlikely to do anything that will cause social unrest internally. And if that means they have to burn a lot more coal than they're doing already, then that is what they will do. And they will not like being told to do otherwise by Swedish teenagers. My second prediction is that Boris will be running around like a Muppet on speed. I don't think that's a particularly contentious prediction. And the third one is going to be very interesting. And maybe Mark would like to comment on this when we're back in the Q&A section. One of the key things that's being teed up for an agreement at COP26 is what's called Article 6. And this is the attempt to get a global carbon pricing mechanism agreement in place. And my prediction is that this will not be agreed, that it will be fudged, or it will just be kicked further down the road. And without a global agreement on carbon pricing, we have to have all sorts of more complex systems, such as the carbon border tariffs. So this is a big one to watch for. In 2010, a professor from Colorado, Roger Pilkey Jr., dubbed this the iron law of climate policy. And he says that when policies on emissions reductions collide with policies focused on economic growth will win out every time. Now, I started with some terms on the introduction slide, and utility is a word that I think we should think more about. It's a word that's used to describe the companies who give us our electricity, our gas, our water, and so on. And the reason for that, it makes sense because in some ways energy is so fundamental to the functioning of modern society that it should be a utility, where the value to society is in reliability, resilience, and managed cost. It's not something that's just a bunch of company profit centers. Affordable energy allows for, and indeed begets, development. There's a very strong correlation between the amount of energy that is consumed by a country and its Human Development Index. And development, and by development we can mean the complexity of society, increases in urbanization, GDP, or wealth. Well, development begets resilience. The wealthier we are, the longer we live, the better healthcare we have, the better we can adapt to rising sea levels if they happen, or indeed adapt to extreme weather events. So fundamentally, there is a serious problem that if we genuinely believe that there's going to be lots of existential threats created by adverse weather effects in the future, the one thing we should not be doing is making ourselves poorer by making energy more expensive. And finally, to wrap up, I gave a presentation to the Parliamentary Group on Energy Studies on the 13th of July. This was about a month before I left the country to move to Canada. So I said to them, look, I really don't have a horse in the race. This is just the way I see it. And my conclusions were a scarcity of legacy fuels, of oil and gas, coupled with the limitations of the alternatives, renewable energy, will lead to higher energy costs. And higher energy costs will change people's priorities. So, and I used that, illustrated this a problem from the spring of 2021, which you've now seen manifest in September. So I'm hoping that at some point I can get myself a second PhD in my preferred subject matter, which is I told you so. And on that happy note, I shall stop and look forward to a Q&A, and I apologize for taking so much time.
Thanks, Richard. I think you might have stunned the crowd there a little bit. So, yeah, in terms of, we have a couple of questions coming in. You talked about your last comment there about changing energy prices will change priorities. Can you just expand on that just a little bit, and then I'll go to the questions.
I think that comes back to the comment or the quote from Roger Pilkey Jr., which is that when individuals are faced with a choice between trying to fix something 30, 40, 50 years out and their household budgets for that week or that month, the choice will come down to their economic prosperity at that point. And this was something that we heard in the Gilets jaunes movement in France. people were saying, we don't care about the end of the century. What we're concerned about is being able to, in French, arrondir le fin du mois, that we can actually, balance our books at the end of the month when we paid all our bills.
Feed ourselves, and
And I think that's where we are likely to see, if this is badly managed, which I think it is being badly managed at the moment, the important work on decarbonisation and the associated cost of it, there will be a populist backlash against it. And I think that's the real danger here.
I mean, one thing that struck me, I know we don't have much time here, is talking about inequalities in society and that the poorest will be most affected. I think that's something that certainly came out of my sustainability studies. If you can reduce inequality, perhaps that's one solution. That's obviously not an easy thing to do, but perhaps more equal societies will fare better. Do you think that's?
I mean, I do, and I think that's probably, if we were to line up what are the single biggest problems in modern societies, then inequality is probably one of them. And unfortunately, one of the things we've seen, and this is probably getting a little bit off topic, is that because we probably got to the peak of prosperity about 20 or 30 years ago, and that's when we had the end of cheap oil and essentially the end of cheap gas. The way that's been managed over the last 20 or 30 years is to buy growth by increasing debt. So we've seen these enormous increases that were started out as quantitative easing in the great financial crisis in 2008 that was supposed to be temporary fixes. But what you can see if you look at the money supply in the US or the UK or Canada or anywhere, is that there is just more and more debt being thrown at the problem. And what that does is that it inflates asset classes. It's being designed specifically to prevent stock market crashes and real estate markets to collapse. And when that happens, all you're doing is you're kicking the can further down the road. And the additional problem with that is it actually increases in inequality, because as we've seen in the pandemic, with the huge amount of debt that was issued and the amount of money that was pumped into the system, rich people got a lot richer and poor people didn't. So there's a problem, and there's a connection between those two things in energy, is that we are having to use printing money as a substitute or a proxy for the fact that we don't have more surplus energy, and we have actually a sort of deflating amount of surplus energy in the system.
Actually, we did have someone raising their hand. Andy Breaks, would you still like to talk? We can.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, Richard. Yes, I'm a disciple of the same thinking as yourself. But when I step back even further, perhaps I take a slightly Malthusian view, but ultimately our global population has been built on cheap energy, and I don't think that it can be sustained without it. But yet it's impossible, I think, to even raise the question of how to stabilize the population, because politically it's an unacceptable topic to talk about. And if you look around, many successful people have actually large families, many leaders. So how can Prince William or Boris with their large families tell the rest of the world that they need to have 2 children rather than 3, 4, 5 or whatever number? And the subject becomes impossible to resolve in any equitable way, but we have too many people to.
Well, I actually, I don't really subscribe to that, because I think we could have a sustainable structure. It would require the wealthier countries to consume less, to have a more of a balanced system. But actually, in terms of population control, which is a horrendous thing to talk about, there's actually a very strong correlation between wealth and family size. And the wealthier a country gets, the lower the family size gets. Now we think of it as, I've taught this at school, the sort of demographic transition where birth rates and death rates have they change over a long period of time, and you have a very large increase in population as a result. What's been shown, and it's described very well in Factfulness by Hans Rosling, is that in countries which go through a very rapid transition of wealth, It can happen in the space of one generation. And he uses the example of Iran, which went from 7 children per family or per woman to about 1.4. Now that stabilizes the population almost instantly. And the secret for doing that is making people wealthier. And what do you need for that? You need more energy.
Well, and that's your dilemma, because you're saying you've got less and less surplus energy. To even maintain a stable population, you still need to maintain the same level of excess energy. So if we're going to go into a situation much higher, if we're going to go into constant population but higher cost energy, you're actually going to hit that problem, aren't you? Because your upper limit is being pushed down.
Well, the population curve, it's almost certain been overestimated, and there's a lot of evidence now that shows that it will plateau at somewhere around about 9.5 billion, and then start declining quite rapidly.
By somewhere later in this century. But on the other hand, we're talking, all the politicians in the world are talking about making our energy more expensive in a much shorter time frame. So there's a period that unless you get fusion working very quickly, you can't have enough energy even to maintain the current population.
Well, I think there's a role which doesn't appeal to a lot of people, but for just normal fission energy, because it does have a fairly high energy return on energy invested, and is low carbon. So I think, there is, if the conversation becomes more rational, we would expect to see vastly more use of nuclear energy. But of course, the people who are against the use of fossil fuels are often against nuclear power as well. You have the low carbon, no carbon, no nuclear lobby, which does leave you in a bit of a quandary.
That's right, but you can only give nuclear fission to people that you trust not to proliferate into nuclear weapons. So it's not a solution.
I don't think we have that choice. I think that's going to happen. That is happening anyway. And there's very little evidence that nuclear power leads to nuclear weapons.
There's a question from Swati which kind of relates to this. She says, what are your thoughts on innovation technology making energy cheaper? So how much can we do? That's what's always. Thanks, Andy. I didn't mean to cut you off, just trying to get a little bit more in. That's always touted as the thing that's going to save us. And what's your thoughts on that?
I think that's right. And I think that, 300 years ago, you had 600 million people thinking about how to make, their lives better. Today, you've got nearly 8 billion people. So, you've got some, serious human capital there, which will, be focused on these issues. One of the things we have seen very surprisingly in the US shale, for example, like most people, I thought they would be down 2 or 3 million barrels a day by now. They're not. Capital has been massively constrained, but they have learned to do a lot more with less. And actually, US shale is producing almost as much now as it was before the pandemic. And that has come about through incremental innovation and technology, but it's been quite dramatic. So I think it's, I think the problem is that there's a lot of, we're going to go down a lot of dead ends, and we're going to spend a lot of money going after projects that aren't necessarily going to work or not going to be very efficient. And I don't know what the answer is, but I am actually quite hopeful from that point of view.
Okay. There are a lot of questions, but I think we'll just have one more, which I think touches on some of the things you talked about. You believe that prosperity brings resilience. This is from Andrew Sims. Not sure the current globalized supply chains that prosperous countries rely on are looking very resilient right now. So just to comment on that, maybe to close us out here.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, and it probably comes down to a definition of what I mean by resilience. Certainly, it is one of the arguments that's being used in Europe at the moment, is that global gas prices, we're being outcompeted by China. Therefore, we should rely more on power sources or energy sources that we have within our borders, which is where the sun shines and the wind blows. And there is some logic to that. You just need to make sure you have your backup plans sorted out. And it's worth thinking that gas-fired plants have oil in storage for when they can't burn gas. Because gas, there's a thing called, which I'm trying to think who came up with the term, but it's called the fatal trifecta, that when you transition your energy system to rely on increasing amounts of renewables, increasing amounts of gas, which of course has the problem of storage, it's a kind of a just-in-time supply, and reliance on neighbors. When you do all three of those things, you are making your system, it's diversifying your sources, but it's making it less resilient. But what I was actually referring to is more resilience in face of natural disasters, because that's what the whole climate debate is about. It's about whether we mitigate carbon dioxide now, or whether we march into a brave new world and we think about how can we adapt to those changes when we get there. And a lot of the work that's been done on this, even the work by William Nordhaus, the Nobel Prize winning economist, is really just trying to compare the cost of mitigation against the cost of adaptation. And for those who've done financial models, if you are modeling something that's going to be happening 50 or 80 years out, the biggest variable in all of those is the discount factor you apply. So there's a huge amount of debate that goes on, and it looks like it's very complex economics, but really all they're discussing is what the discount rate should be used. And sorry, one more point on that is that the hurricane, which is name I forget, that hit Louisiana about a month ago, it was a category 5. It was as big as, if not bigger than, Katrina. And Katrina caused enormous damage, loss of life, devastation. And the one a month and a half ago, it caused a lot of flooding, but after that, it disappeared from the news. And one of the things that was different between the two, and there were probably many things that were different about where it hit and so on and so forth, but in the years since Katrina hit, they've spent $15 billion on adaptation and defenses to what happens when the next hurricane hits. And now I haven't seen any analysis on this, but you could argue that some of that expenditure adapted the coastal environment sufficiently to limit the effects of the weather events. So that's the sort of discussion around mitigation and adaptation.
Yeah. So do you think there's enough discussion going on about adaptation? Or do you think that will become bigger as people change their priorities?
Yeah, I don't think there's enough discussion around it. There are a few people who do, and they are essentially become victim of sort of the cancel culture, because they're immediately being told that what they're saying is that we shouldn't worry about CO2 emissions. We shouldn't worry about mitigation. We should only focus on adaptation. And all they're saying is, well, actually, we should probably have discussion about them. And that kind of discussion isn't really allowed at the moment.
No. Right, well, I think we're out of time, unfortunately. We could have a big debate on this. I would have liked to have got to a few more of the questions. Maybe we can save down the chat and see if some of the pertinent ones can be answered offline. But thank you very much. That was great, Richard. It's always thought-provoking. Unfortunately, you don't come with the answer for all of us about what we're going to do, but I think it's good for people to see what alternative futures and how people's attitudes and priorities are going to change. It's important we all think about this energy trilemma. In the end, I think there's probably, for me, there's too much focus on just net zero and not overall sustainability, and sustainability is about people and profits and the environment. And if we can get some more focus on that, perhaps we'll have but more focus on solutions that are going to work throughout. So thank you, everyone. We are working on more talks with our committee. I don't have the next one fully fledged yet. Hopefully something after COP 26 jointly with Aberdeen. So watch this space, and we will be looking certainly into next year what we can do. Hopefully some face-to-face stuff. I want to do more on skills and a bit of a people focus, but also more on these kind of the carbon economy and maybe more alternative perspectives, which is what we're trying to bring to you all. So thank you everyone for joining, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you.